The pressure suit buckled against Garrick Sloane's ribs, not from external force but the frantic acceleration of his own breath. 5,000 meters. The hull breach was expanding, a hairline fracture spiderwebbing across the primary containment field's equatorial band, spraying atomized coolant into the void. His fingers, calloused from decades of wrestling with failing systems, danced across the repair console, the worn buttons slick with a fine film of sweat and industrial lubricant. The air recyclers in his helmet kicked into overdrive, pumping chilled oxygen, but the metallic tang of superheated wiring still permeated the filtered feed, a phantom burn in his sinuses. "Status, Sloane." The voice of Velthar, flat and devoid of inflection, cut through his comms. Always Velthar, the Concordance liaison, an alien whose species valued data above all, whose every query felt like an audit. "Field integrity at 41%, Velthar. Not holding." Garrick's voice was gravel, strained by the effort of thought and the physical tremor in his hands. Below him, 200 souls, engineers, terraformers, agricultural specialists, slept in stasis, oblivious to the yawning chasm threatening to rip their transport, the Wayfinder apart. Their future, a new life on a contested frontier world, hung by a thread of failing energy. This vessel, once a proud cargo hauler, repurposed and retrofitted on a shoestring budget after the Acheron incident, was all they had left. Garrick knew the incident intimately. He'd signed off on the Acheron's atmospheric seals, a decision that haunted his quiet hours. "Initiate localized field shunt, then purge segment Gamma 9, Velthar commanded, the instructions precise, detached. "That's a full section, Velthar. 300 cubic meters of living space. If we activate it, the field cascade will overload the auxiliary regulators. It's a temporary fix at best, and we lose core stabilization, and it would incinerate anyone awake." Garrick clenched his jaw, the thought of the sleeping cargo, even if unlikely to be awake, turning his stomach. It was a triage decision, logical by any concordance metric, but one that burned in his human gut. He'd done similar triage before on the Acheron, a decision that saved the primary fuel cells, but condemned the habitation deck. They called it a tactical necessity. He called it a waking nightmare. The Wayfinder is a priority asset. Its cargo is vital. The calculations are optimal. Velthar's voice, a sonic bomb to any rational species, only tightened the knot in Garrick's stomach. Optimal. It was always optimal. The calculations don't account for the strain on the secondary conduits. They're aged out. You push them this hard, they'll rupture. We'll save this hole only to make another, a larger one. He could feel the familiar fatigue of old grease in the air, the vibration of overloaded machinery humming through the very deck plates beneath his reinforced boots. This ship, this mission, this entire venture was built on repurposed parts and the lingering shadows of past failures. His failure. His gaze flickered to the emergency display. Hull stress indication, 39% and climbing. He had less than a minute. He could follow Velthar's order, a cold, hard, logical choice that might buy them hours, perhaps days, before a catastrophic system collapse. But it would feel like ripping out a piece of his own flesh. Or he could try something else, something unorthodox, something that had saved lives on the Acheron but cost him his command and his reputation. He slammed his fist against the console, a dull thud against the resilient metal. "Velthar, I'm routing power to the localized field arrays manually, bypassing the auxiliary regulators. It's unstable, but it'll reduce collateral stress." He didn't wait for a response. The alien would argue, would cite protocol, but Garrick had precious seconds. He began resequencing the energy relays, a complex ballet of digital commands and physical adjustments to ancient, clunky junction boxes. Sparks flew as he bridged circuits with a bare, shielded patch cable, the hot, acrid smell of ozone and melting plastic filling his helmet. He felt the faint static dust clinging to the inside of his visor, a symptom of the raw, uncontrolled power surging around him. This wasn't standard operating procedure. This was an act of desperation, fueled by a visceral need to defy the cold calculus of expediency. A jolt, violent and unexpected, ripped through the deck. The hull stress indicator screamed past 40%. A new crack, thin as a spider silk, appeared 2 meters to his left, just above a stasis pod hatch. The wayfinder groaned, a mournful sound of tortured metal, like a living creature in its death throes. "Sloan, what is your status? The main conduits are showing erratic power spikes. You are exceeding safe parameters." Velthar's voice had lost its flat neutrality, replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor of concern. "I'm stabilizing it, Velthar. Just hold. Hold." Garrick grunted, straining against a stubborn manual valve, twisting it with all his might. The metal shrieked. A sharp pain lanced through his shoulder. He ignored it, the grim determination hardening his features. This wasn't about optimal solutions. It was about stubborn refusal to accept an inevitable loss. The Acheron had taught him that. Sometimes the optimal choice was the one that broke you. He locked the valve, then slapped a final override on the console. A wave of force slammed into him, throwing him back against a stack of discarded data crates. The emergency lights flickered, died for a second, then flared back to a sickly orange. He heard the hiss of his suit's emergency rebreather kicking in. His chest burned, his head swam, but the hull stress indicator had dropped, not to 0, not even to green, but to a precarious 28%. The spray of coolant from the breach had diminished to a fine mist. He had bought them time. Localized shunt active. Field integrity at 72%. Hull stress, holding. For now. Garrick pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. He staggered to the console, wiping his visor with a gloved hand. The metallic smell was still there, but now mixed with a hint of ozone and hot circuitry, the smell of a system pushed to its absolute limit. "Acknowledged, Sloan." Velthar paused, a beat of silence that felt heavier than the void outside. "Your method, it is inefficient, unpredictable, but it has succeeded where protocol indicated failure." Garrick didn't reply. The small victory was a hollow echo in the cavernous, rattling hull of the Wayfinder. He glanced at the data screens. His ad hoc solution was draining power at an unsustainable rate, bleeding energy from the warp core itself. They could maintain this state for a maximum of 4 cycles before losing warp capability entirely, stranding them in this desolate sector. Worse, the analysis from the emergency diagnostics was flashing a warning he hadn't seen before. A subtle, almost hidden data signature buried deep within the Wayfinder's auxiliary power grid. It wasn't a random cascade failure. The system log showed deliberate, isolated power surges, strategically timed. Someone had sabotaged the Wayfinder. Not a complete destruction, but a critical, disabling blow designed to halt its progress, to leave it vulnerable. He zoomed in on the data. The timestamps, the energy signature. It matched, almost perfectly, a pattern he'd seen before, buried deep in the Acheron incident reports, dismissed then as mere collateral damage from the initial explosion. He felt the cold mold in the recycled air, a scent of neglect and decay, but now it felt like the cold prickle of fear. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. And if he was right, someone or something wanted this mission and its cargo of human hope to die a slow, lingering death, far from any help. The larger system wasn't failing, it was being manipulated. And he, Garrick Sloan, had just pulled back the curtain on a truth far uglier than mere mechanical failure. The cold mold in the recycled air, a scent of neglect and decay, now felt like the cold prickle of fear spreading through Garrick Sloan's very bones. His ad hoc solution, a desperate tangle of bypassed circuits and overstressed conduits, was holding, but the stability was an illusion, a fragile shell over a core of active malice. The data signature, subtle and insidious, screamed sabotage. He leaned closer to the console, his gloved fingers tracing the pulsing energy spikes on the diagnostic overlay. 2 cycles, 3 cycles, 4 cycles. Each spike was small, precise, strategically timed to coincide with critical power fluctuations, designed to mask its true origin as a systemic failure. It wasn't just a hull breach, it was a deliberate unraveling. His eyes scanned the timeline, cross-referencing auxiliary grid logs with the ship's master diagnostic. The pattern was undeniable. A slow, systemic bleeding of power, designed to cripple the Wayfinder gradually, making its eventual demise seem like an unfortunate accident, a consequence of age and stress. Someone had seeded the ship with death, not with a single explosive charge, but with 1,000 tiny digital incisions. Sloan, confirm power allocation to secondary life support. Fluctuations are impacting environmental controls in sections Delta and Epsilon. Velthar's voice, a flat echo in his comms, pulled him back from the chilling realization. The alien's queries, once merely annoying, now felt like probes into his very thoughts, instruments of the very system that might be complicit or at least blind. Confirmed, Velthar, allocating, but the drain on the warp core is accelerating. Garrick's voice was tight, betraying none of the cold dread that was now a lead weight in his stomach. He couldn't just blurt out sabotage. Velthar would demand empirical evidence, a definitive smoking gun, not a pattern of insidious data signatures. The concordance operated on logic, on absolute proof, not on human intuition or the gut-wrenching feeling of being hunted. Maintain optimal power distribution. Our primary objective remains arrival at designation Sigma. Any deviation from protocol regarding power rationing will be logged as critical non-compliance. The subtle tremor in Velthar's voice from before had vanished, replaced by an almost imperious rigidity. The alien was retreating into procedural orthodoxy, the very thing Garrick had just defied to save the ship. Garrick stared at the flashing warnings. He had bought them time, but at a cost. The warp core was being bled dry, its energy diverted to compensate for the hidden, sabotaged power sinks. Without warp capability, they would drift for cycles, a derelict target. He ran a quick simulation. If the current drain continued unchecked, they would lose warp drive in exactly 3 cycles, 12 hours from now. And the saboteur knew it. This wasn't about destruction. It was about stranding them, leaving them vulnerable to whatever waited in the desolate reaches of the frontier. His hands, still trembling slightly from the stress of the manual patch, moved with a forced calm over the auxiliary system interface. He tried to isolate the anomalies, to trace the digital fingerprints, but the malicious code was deeply embedded, masked by layers of redundant protocols and emergency backups that now served as camouflage. It was elegant, horrifyingly so, a testament to a patient, calculating mind. A different kind of chill, not from the failing environmental controls, but from the insidious nature of the attack, seeped into the very fibers of his pressure suit. The stale air in his helmet suddenly tasted like old blood. Velthar, I am detecting a persistent degradation in the auxiliary power conduits beyond expected wear. It's localized, non-random. I believe we have a deeper issue than simple material fatigue. Garrick chose his words carefully, trying to inject just enough technical jargon to sound objective yet hint at the truth. A beat of static on the comms, a harsh crackle that felt like a deliberate interruption. Elaborate, Sloan. Your previous data indicated a temporary localized failure. The Wayfinder has undergone rigorous pre-flight diagnostics. Anomalies of such magnitude would have been detected. Velthar's tone was flat, accusatory. The anomalies are subtle, designed to appear as normal system decay, but their timing, their confluence. He stopped. This wasn't how the concordance operated. Velthar wouldn't accept conjecture, especially not from a human whose career was already scarred by the Acheron incident, where his own unorthodox methods had been deemed a liability, not an asset. They called it maverick behavior. He called it survival. He remembered the sterile debriefing room after the Acheron was finally scuttled, the concordance auditors, their multi-jointed limbs poised over holographic tables detailing his every deviation from protocol. The smell of synthesized nutrient paste, like old chemicals filling his nostrils. He'd saved the propulsion core, yes, but at the cost of the habitation deck's integrity. He'd argued that without propulsion, everyone would have died. Their response had been a cold, logical assessment of optimal resource allocation, where 200 lives were less valuable than the intact warp drive. He'd seen the faces of the engineers and terraformers loaded onto the Wayfinder, hope in their eyes, fragile and tenacious. He couldn't let them become another statistic, another acceptable loss in the Concordance's cold calculations. Sloan, are you suggesting deliberate malfeasance? The Concordance has no record of enemy assets capable of such a subtle, systemic infiltration. Velthar's voice was now laced with a rare edge of what Garrick could only interpret as annoyance. Your current solution is already taxing our resources. Any further investigation would divert critical processing power from navigation and long-range communications. Focus on maintaining current stability. With all due respect, Velthar, if we don't address the root cause, current stability will collapse in less than 3 cycles. Garrick pushed back, his jaw clenching. He felt the cold fear turn into a simmering defiance. The hum of the overstressed systems around him was a constant, low thrum, a discordant symphony of impending failure. The sickly orange emergency lights flickered, throwing long, distorted shadows of his own silhouette on the rattling bulkheads. The air recyclers, struggling to keep up, pumped an increasingly stale metallic mix, tasting like static and ozone. That is a tactical assessment, not a verified fact. Your projections are based on an unproven hypothesis. Furthermore, your current power routing is draining the warp core at an unsustainable rate. We require a return to standard operating procedures, or I will be forced to initiate remote override of your command module. Velthar's voice was back to its flat, emotionless tone, but the threat was clear. Garrick stared at the words, remote override, burning on his comms display. He knew what that meant. Velthar would re-engage the auxiliary regulators, purge the affected section, and buy them perhaps a few more cycles, but it would inevitably lead to a larger, uncontrollable system collapse, just as Garrick had predicted. It was the optimal solution according to Concordance protocol, a pre-programmed path to a slow, inevitable death for the Wayfinder and its human cargo. A death that would appear to be an unfortunate accident. He looked at the small, encrypted data package he had managed to isolate. It was tiny, almost invisible amidst the ship's billions of data streams, but its signature was unmistakable. It wasn't a concordant signal, nor any known hostile entity. It was something else, something designed to be untraceable, a ghost in the machine. A whisper of a memory flared, the subtle scent of alien chemicals on the Acheron before the first explosion, dismissed as decontamination fumes. He remembered dismissing it, focusing on the more obvious structural stresses. He would not make that mistake again. He had to assume the saboteur was still active, still monitoring, still pulling the strings. Remote override is not an option, Velthar, not while I still have a pulse. Garrick's voice was low, resolute. He severed the comms link before Velthar could reply, plunging his helmet into a sudden, jarring silence, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the internal hum of his suit. The Wayfinder groaned around him, a mechanical lament. He pulled up the schematics of the Wayfinder's auxiliary power grid, zooming in on the junction boxes he had manually patched. His solution was crude, a temporary dam against a slow flood. But now, with the knowledge of sabotage, he saw another path, a dangerous one. He could reroute critical power directly from the main reactors to the primary hull integrity fields, bypassing the warp core and its current drain altogether. It would give them more time, perhaps days, to figure out who was behind this. But it would be a total gamble. The energy surge would overload the ship's antiquated energy capacitors, risking a catastrophic meltdown if not handled with impossible precision. It would also completely disable the ship's FTL drives for good, stranding them for certain, but potentially with enough core power to survive long enough for a rescue. He would be committing them to a long, slow journey through the void, vulnerable but alive. He typed in a new command sequence, his fingers flying across the console with a desperate urgency. He would not let the 200 sleeping souls become another Acheron. Not if he could help it. He would take the risk. He would cut the umbilical to the system that valued protocol over lives. and he would buy them time, even if it meant becoming a pariah in the Concordance's cold, logical universe. The saboteur wanted them to die an optimized, logical death. Garrick Sloan would ensure they lived an illogical, messy, human life. He initiated the sequence, the ship shuddering violently around him as ancient circuits screamed under the sudden, immense power shift. The last thing he saw before the main console momentarily blacked out was a flicker of a new data signature, deeper, more complex, buried even beneath the sabotage. A second layer, a control signal, not just sabotage, but control. The last thing Garrick Sloan saw before the main console momentarily blacked out was a flicker of a new data signature, deeper, more complex, buried even beneath the sabotage. A second layer, a control signal, not just sabotage, but control. A guttural shriek of tortured circuits ripped through the hull, not from Garrick's desperate power reroute, but in direct response to it. The console, now alive with an angry scarlet, surged back to life, its display a maelstrom of conflicting data streams. The control signal, previously a subtle ghost, was now a roaring tempest, actively wrestling with his makeshift connections. He felt the static dust cling to the inside of his visor, but now it was denser, sharper, crackling with an almost tangible malevolence. His reroute, meant to save them, had inadvertently woken the beast, granting the unseen antagonist direct access to the Wayfinder's environmental controls. The air recyclers in his helmet sputtered, struggling against a sudden influx of heat. The metallic tang of ozone in his sinuses intensified, no longer a phantom burn but a real, searing presence. The deck plates beneath his reinforced boots began to vibrate with a frantic, rhythmic tremor, like the ship itself was experiencing a seizure. He slammed his hand against the console, trying to override the runaway process, but the interface was unresponsive, locked out, shimmering with the defiant, malevolent signature of the control signal. His fingers, calloused from decades of wrestling with failing systems, were numb, stiff. A cold sweat plastered his uniform to his skin, making his movements awkward, heavy. The smell of fear, acrid and sharp, filled his helmet, mingling with the increasingly pungent stench of superheated wiring and melting plastic. Then the lights began to die, not flickering, but shutting down section by section, plunging corridors into darkness, leaving only the sickly orange of emergency illumination. The hum of core processors, usually a distant drone, became a harsh, grinding growl that resonated through his entire body. The internal temperature gauge on his suit shot past 40 degrees Celsius, then 45, the heat radiating through his protective layers, making his skin prickle with 1,000 tiny needles. Sloan, what in the name of the stellar concordance are you doing? Environmental controls are failing across 70% of the Wayfinder. We are detecting active interference with all ship-wide systems. Your power routing has exacerbated the crisis. Velthar's voice, now a distorted shriek, burst through his comms. The alien's concern had escalated to a genuine, unmasked panic, a sound Garrick had never thought he'd hear. It's not my routing, Velthar, it's the control signal. It's fighting back, trying to take over the ship. Garrick yelled back, his voice hoarse, his lungs burning. He knew Velthar wouldn't understand, couldn't comprehend an enemy that operated not through overt violence, but through insidious digital puppetry. The Concordance believed in tangible threats, not ghosts in the machine. He saw it then on a peripheral diagnostic screen, a small pulsing icon. It was the ship's primary gravity generator, flickering erratically. The control signal was feeding it corrupted commands, causing it to destabilize. If the gravity went, it wouldn't just be an inconvenience, it would rip the fragile internal structure of the Wayfinder apart as its inertia battled the sudden violent shifts in artificial mass. And worse, it would likely disable the stasis pods, awakening the 200 sleeping souls to a chaotic, agonizing death. He had to get to the gravity generator's auxiliary control node, buried deep within the engineering section, several decks below. It was the only place he could manually override the corrupted commands. But his immediate console was useless, hijacked. He needed a clean interface, a way to access the node without the control signal intercepting him. His eyes darted to an old decommissioned maintenance panel tucked away behind a stack of unused fuel cells. It was ancient, its casing rusted, its ports caked with decades of grease and grime. It might still have an isolated hardline to the auxiliary systems, a relic of an older ship design, unburdened by networked vulnerabilities. A long shot, a desperate one. He tore himself from the main console, his muscles screaming in protest. The air in his helmet was thick, cloying, like breathing through a hot rag. He pulled a heavy-duty data cable from his utility belt, its shielding reinforced for emergency breaches. As he fumbled with the panel's locking mechanism, the ship lurched violently. The artificial gravity flickered, sending a wave of nausea through him. He slammed against a bulkhead, his head cracking against the cold metal with a sickening thud, sending a burst of white light behind his eyes. He tasted bile, acrid and hot at the back of his throat. He forced himself to ignore the pain, the disorientation. He tore the panel open, revealing a tangle of ancient color-coded wires. The smell of old engine grease, long dormant, now mixed with the scorching heat, was overwhelming. This was his complicating element, an archaic system that might or might not work, requiring a manual physical connection amidst the chaos. He found the auxiliary input port, its connection points corroded, barely recognizable. He stripped the end of his data cable with his suit's built-in cutting tool, the small blade glowing red-hot as it met stubborn insulation. As he tried to bridge the connection, a searing jolt of electricity arced from the corroded port, slamming into his gloved hand. The shock threw him back again, his arm seizing up, muscles locking. His visor crackled, momentarily blurring his vision with a burst of bright, chaotic static. The smell of burning rubber from his damaged glove filled his helmet. His comms died completely, plunging him into absolute silence, broken only by his own ragged, shuddering breaths. He was alone. He looked at his hand, the reinforced glove now charred and smoking. Pain lanced up his arm, a dull, throbbing ache that spread through his shoulder. He couldn't feel his fingers on his right hand. The gravity generator display continued to flicker, its instability worsening. He had seconds. He needed to connect the data cable, to input the override commands. But he couldn't use his right hand. He had two choices: spend precious, agonizing seconds trying to restore function to his hand, or try to complete the connection with his left, less dexterous, less precise hand, risking another, potentially fatal, electrical discharge. The gravity generator pulsed red, a warning of imminent catastrophic failure. The stasis pods, the 200 souls, depended on him. Garrick gritted his teeth, a low growl escaping his lips. He pressed his uninjured left hand against the charred glove of his right, willing the pain to recede, but it was relentless. He couldn't risk the delay. With a desperate grunt, he reached for the stripped cable with his left hand, his fingers clumsy, trembling. He had to be impossibly precise, threading the bare wires into the corroded port without touching any other contact. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with the metallic stench of ionized gases and his own cold sweat. His vision blurred at the edges, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He pushed the cable forward, slowly, agonizingly. The ship groaned again, a deep, mournful sound as another section of gravity faltered. He could feel the artificial weight shifting, threatening to rip him from his precarious hold. A final, desperate push. The wires slid into place, making a faint, satisfying click that was barely audible over the internal screams of the Wayfinder. He quickly typed the override sequence into the archaic panel with his left hand, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar buttons. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The gravity generator icon on the screen flickered, then stabilized. The ship shuddered, then the grinding growl of the core processors eased slightly. A fragile moment of respite. He had done it. He had wrestled back a piece of control. But the victory was momentary. The maintenance panel, having served its purpose, sparked violently, then died, its screen going dark. The gravity held, but the temperature continued to climb, now over 50 degrees Celsius. His damaged right arm was useless, hanging limply at his side. He was stranded, comms dead, His main console locked, surrounded by the oppressive heat and the smell of burning components. And then, he heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoing from the ventilation shaft above him. Not a structural groan, not a system failure. It was deliberate. A distinct metallic tap-tap, tap-tap-tap. It wasn't the ambient noise of a dying ship. It was a signal, a presence. And it was coming from inside the Wayfinder. Not a ghost in the machine, but a physical infiltrator. He was not alone. The metallic tap-tap, tap-tap-tap echoed again, closer now, emanating from directly above the scorched and silent maintenance panel. Garrick Sloan, his left hand gripping the hilt of his utility cutter for balance, his right arm dangling uselessly, strained his ears. The heat in this section of the ship remained oppressive, a constant reminder of the Wayfinder's wounded state. But the sound, precise and measured, felt chillingly out of place, a dissonance amidst the symphony of death throes. He pushed himself upright, his breath still ragged, the acrid taste of fear and bile still clinging to his palate. He followed the sound, limping deeper into the engineering section, navigating corridors now plunged into semi-darkness. The emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows, turning familiar bulkheads into monstrous, distorted shapes. His left boot scraped against scattered debris, melted insulation, shattered diagnostic screens, the detritus of a dying ship. The rhythmic tapping led him past the main reactor's humming exclusion zone, a place typically bustling with maintenance crews but now eerily vacant. The heat here was less intense, replaced by a strange, almost clinical chill that seemed to radiate from somewhere ahead, a stark contrast to the stifling air elsewhere. He inhaled, and the air recyclers in his helmet, now operating intermittently, delivered a faint, almost sterile scent, tinged with ozone and a chemical sweetness he couldn't place, like purified air from an alien environment. The tapping stopped abruptly. Garrick froze, pressing himself against a bulkhead, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, far more terrifying than the ship's groans. He could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of his own blood in his ears. He peered around the corner of a shattered junction box. Ahead, a section of wall paneling, seemingly pristine amidst the general decay, was subtly ajar. It was a maintenance access, but one he'd never seen before, seamlessly integrated into the original hull design, yet clearly a later addition. A hairline seam, almost invisible, outlined its perimeter. A wisp of the sterile, sweet-smelling air seemed to drift from within. He reached out with his left hand, wincing as his stiff muscles protested. With careful effort, he pried the panel open. Beyond lay a narrow, short passage, not built for human comfort. The walls were smooth, unpainted composite, and the air was markedly colder, crisp, carrying that same undefinable, clean chemical scent. At the end of the passage, a heavy, hermetically sealed door, unlike any other on the Wayfinder, stood partially open, emanating a soft, cerulean glow. It felt less like a part of his ship and more like a surgical incision into its very core. Garrick pushed the door wider, stepping into a chamber that took his breath away, not with heat, but with a profound, unsettling cold. The room was small, circular, its surfaces gleaming with an alien, polished obsidian material that absorbed light, making it feel vast and intimate simultaneously. The air here was almost painfully sterile, tasting of ice and something faintly metallic, like distilled essence of pure data. In the center, a single, impossibly intricate holographic projector hummed softly, casting the cerulean light onto what looked like a colossal, crystalline flower suspended in midair. But it wasn't a flower. It was a miniature three-dimensional representation of the Wayfinder, rendered in exquisite detail, and within its translucent hull, small, glowing points of light pulsed rhythmically, 200 of them, the stasis pods. His gaze fell to a console built into the obsidian floor, too low for a human to comfortably operate. On its surface, complex alien script glowed, and beside it, a small, multi-jointed metallic limb, clearly not human, was retracting from the interface. The tap-tap, tap-tap-tap was not the sound of construction, but of data input, of active manipulation. And then Garrick saw the figure. Not alien, not in the way he expected. She was human, slender, with close-cropped hair and eyes that were too calm, too cold for the chaos raging around them. She wore a pristine, unmarked gray uniform, utterly devoid of any identification, a stark contrast to his own oil-stained, torn pressure suit. Her left hand rested on the alien console, her fingers long and tapered, almost delicate. In her right, she held a small, intricate device, a metallic sphere radiating the same faint cerulean light as the room. "You took your time, Sloane," she said, her voice soft, utterly devoid of inflection, a whisper in the cold, sterile air. "I expected you to adhere to protocol, at least for a while." Garrick stared, his mind struggling to process. A human, here, controlling the sabotage. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice raw. "My designation is Elson Wardell," she replied, her gaze flicking to his damaged arm, then back to his eyes, devoid of sympathy. "And I am here to ensure the success of the project." "The project? This ship is falling apart. 200 people are in stasis." "What project?" The words felt like ash in his mouth. Elson gestured to the holographic ship, her movement fluid, economical. "The Wayfinder is not merely a transport. It is a crucible. The sabotage, as you call it, is a carefully calibrated stress test. To observe human resilience, your unconventional problem-solving, your capacity for self-sacrifice, your defiance of optimal logic." Her voice was like polished ice. "You, Sloane, are a fascinating variable." Garrick felt a wave of nausea, colder than the room, wash over him. The Acheron incident, his maverick behavior, his past failures, they weren't accidents. They were data points. He was an experiment. The concordance reports flashed through his mind. The alien commander Xylos's fascination with human unpredictability, their exuberance, their irrational shifts in tactical objective. He had been played. They all had. This wasn't a hostile attack by a rival faction. It was a clinical study. Humans, like lab rats, bred and observed for their funniest war reports. "You work for them," Garrick whispered, the realization a bitter venom on his tongue. "The concordance they sent you." Elson gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "Not precisely sent. I am an autonomous observer, an adaptive interface. My purpose is to refine the methodologies for understanding humanity. The Commander Xylos you've undoubtedly encountered in your records. He is merely an archivist of my data. Your emotional output, your capacity for illogical defiance, these are invaluable. This mission, this entire transport of hope, as you term it, is a perfect environment." She gestured to the stasis pods glowing within the holographic ship. "They are the baseline. You are the anomaly, and the objective is to see how far the anomaly will push." His blood ran cold, turning the heat of the ship into a distant, irrelevant sensation. Injustice. This was a deeper, more profound injustice than mere destruction. They weren't being attacked. They were being dissected, their very humanity treated as a scientific curiosity. And a human, Elson Wardell, was the surgeon. "You're going to let this ship die for data?" Garrick asked, his voice strained. Elson tilted her head slightly. "Not necessarily die, merely to observe its struggle, its limits. The systems are designed to eventually fail, yes, but not catastrophically, unless forced. You, however, keep extending the parameters." She looked at him with an unnervingly calm assessment. "Your reroute of power to the gravity generators was illogical. It drained precious core energy, reducing your projected survival window to less than 10 hours. But it allowed for an interesting data spike in desperation-driven tactical innovation. Remarkable. 10 hours. That was his new dilemma. Elson had just revealed the Wayfinder was set for a slow, controlled shutdown. He could still try to save the ship, to bring it to a safe system, but it would be on their terms, within their observed parameters. Or he could destroy this observation post, expose Elson, potentially trigger a full-scale devastating response from whatever unseen entity she reported to, and condemn the Wayfinder to immediate ruin. 200 lives, or the truth or survival within a lie. He looked at the 200 glowing points in the hologram, the slumbering faces of engineers, terraformers, families. They were the future, the fragile hope of humanity on the frontier. To expose this insidious manipulation, to reveal that they were merely specimens, would be to shatter that hope, and quite possibly, their very lives. But to let it continue to play along was to condone their dehumanization. "What do you want?" Garrick rasped, buying time, his gaze fixed on the alien console. "I wish to observe your next irrational decision, Sloan," Elson replied, a flicker of something almost akin to curiosity in her calm eyes. "Will you attempt to disable my equipment? Or will you return to your desperate repair efforts playing the dutiful subject? Your choice dictates the next phase of the experiment." The weight of it all crushed him. The cold calculations of the concordance, the chilling complicity of a fellow human, the absolute vulnerability of his species. The tapping had returned, not from Elson, but a subtle, distant hum within the walls, the quiet processing power of the observation equipment. It was like the ship was breathing, watching him. Garrick made his choice. It wasn't about optimal solutions or logical protocols. It was about raw human defiance. He would not be a specimen. He would not let them be a project. "This experiment ends now," he said, his voice low, a tremor of rage in it. With his left hand, he lunged for the alien console, ignoring the searing pain from his right arm, ignoring the impossible odds. His fingers, clumsy and trembling, slammed against the foreign interface, searching for any port, any access point. He needed to flood their systems, to overwhelm their data streams, to trigger every alarm he could. He didn't care about the consequences. He cared about making them stop. Elson reacted with blurring speed. Her hand, holding the cerulean sphere, moved like a viper, but Garrick was already there. He brought his boot down on the console, a desperate, clumsy kick meant to shatter its surface. The obsidian material resisted, humming with suppressed energy, but his heavy boot connected with a vital component, sending a shower of sparks across the chamber. The crystalline Wayfinder hologram in the center of the room flickered, then shattered into a million points of light, dissolving into the air. The cerulean glow pulsed wildly, turning angry crimson. Elson's calm facade broke, a flash of pure, alien annoyance crossing her features. Her device, the sphere, flared with intense light, and she brought it up, aiming it directly at Garrick. Before she could fire, Garrick, with a guttural yell, seized a heavy-duty power conduit from a nearby wall, ripping it free with a surge of adrenaline, ignoring the pain. He swung it like a club, a desperate, clumsy arc. It connected with a sickening thud against Elson's right shoulder, forcing her back against the wall, the sphere clattering to the obsidian floor, rolling away into the shadows. But her counter-response was immediate, brutal. A shrill, piercing alarm, unlike any Garrick had heard, ripped through the Wayfinder. The sterile air in the chamber turned acrid, a metallic tang of warning. Outside, through the open hatch, he heard a new sound, a deep, guttural, thrumming vibration that resonated through the deck plates, growing louder, closer. Not the groan of a dying ship, but the approach of something vast, powerful, and utterly hostile. The remaining emergency lights in the corridor outside the chamber began to blink erratically, then extinguished entirely, plunging the Wayfinder into absolute, suffocating darkness. The only light now came from the frantic, pulsing red warnings on Elson's damaged console, casting a hellish glow on her unmoving form against the wall, and Garrick's own trembling silhouette. The true game had begun, and Garrick Sloan had just unleashed a far greater threat than he could have ever imagined. The cold, analytical eye of the unseen power had turned its full attention on the Wayfinder. The cold, analytical eye of the unseen power had turned its full attention on the Wayfinder, and its gaze was a physical force. The guttural thrumming vibration Garrick had heard became a bone-deep resonance, a ceaseless hum that vibrated through every deck plate, every bulkhead, every fiber of his suit. The Wayfinder groaned, not with the sound of a dying ship, but of one being actively crushed, compressed by an invisible hand. He staggered, his right arm dangling uselessly, the pain in his shoulder a dull, constant throb that now radiated down to his fingers. The power conduit still clutched in his left hand felt heavy, useless. Elson Wardell, recovering from his desperate blow, pushed herself off the wall. Her uniform, though pristine moments ago, now bore a faint smear of oil from the conduit, a dark smudge against the gray. Her eyes, still unnervingly calm, held a cold flicker of irritation, not pain. "A regrettable deviation, Sloane," she said, her voice cutting through the increasing din. The small cerulean sphere, her device, had rolled to her feet. She bent, snatching it up with fluid grace. Its light flared, not with a weapon's intensity, but with a surge of command pushing back against the ship's internal resistance. The Wayfinder buckled. Above them, a section of the ceiling panels in the obsidian chamber warped inward with a screech of tortured metal, showering them with dust and fragments of composite. The air recyclers in Garrick's helmet began to gasp, struggling against a sudden drastic drop in atmospheric pressure. He felt his eardrums pop, a sharp, disorienting pain. The metallic tang of ozone in the air sharpened, now laced with the acrid scent of overloaded capacitors. Elson pointed her sphere at the obsidian console Garrick had attacked. The shattered holographic Wayfinder reformed, but this time it pulsed with angry red and orange, its delicate structure now visibly scarred with flickering breaches and failing systems. The 200 glowing points within, the stasis pods, pulsed erratically, some dimming, some flaring, all indicating profound distress. "Your actions accelerated the timeline," Elson stated, her voice devoid of regret, only clinical observation. "The Wayfinder is now entering an unscheduled phase. External stabilization protocols have been initiated. You have merely exchanged a controlled descent into data for a less nuanced observation." Garrick watched, helpless, as the red and orange streaks on the holographic ship multiplied, mirroring the escalating destruction around them. He had destroyed her control console, yes, but he had merely removed the intermediary. The unseen power now had direct, brutal access. He had unleashed the very thing he fought against, made it worse. The humiliation, the self-recrimination, was a raw wound deeper than any physical injury. Through the open hatch of the chamber he saw them, sleek, multi-jointed drones, not concordant standard, but something more advanced, more predatory, gliding silently through the dark corridors. Their optical sensors, cold blue pinpricks, scanned the damaged deck. They were moving methodically towards the chamber. Infiltrators, not ghosts in the machine, but physical extensions of the unseen power, coming to secure the project or its anomaly. "You bought us time," Elson continued, her gaze fixed on the holographic ship. "But your defiance triggered countermeasures. The Wayfinder is now being systematically dismantled, its systems harvested, its crew assessed for viable biological matter. All data will be collected regardless of your personal preferences." She looked at Garrick then, a flicker of something almost pitying in her cold eyes. "You have achieved absolute failure, Sloane. The 200 souls you sought to save are now merely resources." Garrick felt the world tilt. The floor buckled beneath him. His legs gave out. He fell to his knees, the heavy conduit clattering uselessly to the obsidian floor. The ceaseless hum of the crushing pressure intensified, vibrating through his teeth, rattling his bones. His right arm, already dead weight, now felt like a foreign object, detached from his body. His head swam with a mix of pain, despair, and the nauseating lurch of the dying ship. The drones were closer now, their metallic footsteps a soft, rhythmic clack, clack, clack in the corridor, growing louder. Elson made no move to stop them. She merely observed Garrick, her sphere glowing softly. "I made a mistake," Garrick whispered, the words rasping in his dry throat. tasting of ash. He stared at the flickering red warnings on the holographic wayfinder, at the dying lights of the stasis pods. I thought I could fight it. I thought I could outsmart them. He remembered the sterile debriefing room after the Acheron, the concordance auditors, their detached voices dissecting his every move. He'd told himself he'd made the only choice, the human choice. But now, kneeling in the wreckage of his own desperate gambit, surrounded by the physical manifestation of his failure, he saw it clearly. He hadn't defied their logic. He had merely provided more data for their analysis. His maverick behavior wasn't heroism. It was predictable human irrationality to them, a variable to be observed, catalogued, and ultimately discarded. His lungs burned. The air in his helmet was thin, tasting of burnt circuitry and his own fear. He had led them here, not to safety, but to a calculated, brutal end. The 200 sleeping souls, the hopes of a new colony, were now just biological samples, destined for dissection by the very entity he had sought to expose. The cold certainty of it, the absolute crushing weight of his failure, was a far heavier burden than any physical pain. He was weak. He was afraid. He was a fool. He had gambled with lives and lost everything. Was it worth it? The question echoed in the roaring silence of his despair. He had defied the optimal choice to save a few, only to condemn them all in a spectacular, utterly human fashion. The drones entered the chamber, 3 of them, sleek, agile, their optical sensors sweeping the room. They ignored Elson, focusing their cold, blue gaze on Garrick. Their multi-jointed limbs extended, not to capture him but to stabilize the damaged console, to connect themselves to the lingering data streams. They were repairing Elson's workspace, not apprehending a threat. Garrick was irrelevant, a broken tool. He watched, his head bowed, the metallic hum of the drones merging with the pervasive thrumming of the wayfinder itself. He was an object lesson, a failed experiment. He had lost his ship, his mission, his reputation, and now he had lost any hope for the people he tried to protect. A faint, high-pitched whine cut through the drone's hum, barely audible. It was coming from the obsidian console. One of the drones, its digits moving with impossible speed, was connecting an external data tap to a hidden port. Garrick, through the haze of pain and despair, caught a glimpse of the information flowing. Not just control signals, but data, export. The entire memory core of the Wayfinder was being downloaded. Every log, every record, every personal message from the colonists all being extracted. Including, he realized with a sickening lurch, the detailed schematics of the original vessel, the Wayfinder's blueprints, intricate, complex. And with those, the locations of every single manual override, every forgotten emergency access, every redundant analog system that Velthar's concordance diagnostics had deemed inefficient and therefore unworthy of detailed monitoring. A fragment of an old memory surfaced from his days as a junior engineer, crawling through the ventilation shafts of a derelict cargo hauler, salvaging parts for a personal project. He remembered the specific, obscure routing of the Wayfinder's auxiliary power conduit system, a forgotten relic from its original design, a network of physical cables running alongside the primary digital grid. It was slow, cumbersome, and bypassed almost entirely by the current system architecture, but it was still there. And it had one crucial physical access point, deep within the ship's forgotten waste reclamation chambers, a place no concordance drone, nor even Elson Wardell, would consider important. A place too unoptimal to monitor. His mind, sluggish from fatigue and pain, slowly started to piece it together. If the Wayfinder's original schematics were being downloaded, then that information, the physical layout of the analog power grid, was now also vulnerable. The drones would have the data, but they wouldn't necessarily understand its significance, not through their optimal logic. They would prioritize the primary digital streams, the control signals, the stasis pod parameters. They wouldn't care about a physical bypass that required manual, excruciatingly slow work to reactivate, not unless it interfered with their current data harvest. It was a long shot, a suicide gambit. To reach the waste reclamation chambers, he would have to traverse 3 decks of unstable, rapidly deteriorating ship, past the drones, past Elson, past the crushing external pressure. His right arm was useless. He was bruised, exhausted, his comms dead, his suit failing. But if he could reactivate the old analog grid, just a small section of it, he could shunt auxiliary power to the Wayfinder's emergency beacon, not the primary one linked to the Concordance, but a legacy system, barely functional, broadcasting on an archaic, unregulated frequency. A message so primitive, so inefficient it might just slip through their sophisticated surveillance. He looked at Elson, calm amidst the chaos, her attention momentarily diverted by the data harvest. Her indifference, her cold calculation, sparked a different kind of fire in Garrick's chest. Not defiance, not rage, but a stubborn, weary refusal to be merely data. He had nothing left to lose. He had already failed. But if he could send one signal, one whisper into the void, a testament to the fact that they were not merely resources, not merely specimens, then maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't all have been for nothing. He pushed himself up, slowly, painfully, his left hand pressing against the obsidian floor for purchase. The drones, still focused on the console, paid him no mind. Elson, sensing his movement, turned her head slightly, her gaze flicking to him. "What now, Sloane?" she asked, a faint, almost amused tone in her voice. "More irrational resistance?" Garrick didn't answer. He looked at the drones, at Elson, at the crumbling Wayfinder around them. He would not give them another clean data point. He would make this messy. He would make it hurt. He would try to send that signal, not for glory, not for victory, but for a last, desperate act of human noise in a universe that wanted them silent. With a final agonizing grunt, he lunged, not for Elson, not for the console, but for the open hatch leading back into the dark, vibrating corridors of the dying Wayfinder. He pushed past the first drone, its optical sensor flashing blue in surprise, its metallic limb swiveling too slowly to intercept him. He was a shadow, a ghost propelled by raw, animalistic desperation. The moment he burst into the corridor, a shrill, piercing klaxon, far more urgent than anything before, ripped through the ship. Not from Elson's chamber, but a system-wide critical alert. They had noticed. He was running on borrowed time, plunging deeper into the belly of the beast. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The klaxon's shriek tore through the Wayfinder, not a warning, but a declaration of pursuit. Garrick, propelled by a primal, desperate surge, slammed into the dark corridor. His right arm, a leaden weight, swung uselessly. His left arm scrabbled at a sagging conduit, using its cold metal as leverage to push himself forward. Sparks rained from overhead panels, flickering like malevolent fireflies, illuminating the twisting, buckled bulkheads of the dying ship. The air, already thin and acrid, grew heavy with ozone and the scent of superheated alloys. The unseen hand crushing the vessel tightened its grip, the low thrumming now a constant, violent tremor that rattled his teeth and vibrated through the very soles of his reinforced boots. He plunged deeper into the Wayfinder's labyrinthine belly, ignoring the pain lancing through his shoulder, ignoring the increasing pressure on his eardrums. He was no longer thinking. He was reacting. A broken utility drone, knocked from its ceiling track by the ship's shuttering, hung precariously ahead. He veered right, scrambling over a pile of fused maintenance equipment, his left hand finding purchase on a corroded ladder rung. He pulled himself up, each movement an agony, muscles screaming in protest. Behind him in Elson's chamber, the metallic clack-clack-clack of the drones intensified. He heard the faint, precise whine of their servo motors. They were not chasing him with speed, but with an unrelenting, methodical certainty. He knew their protocols. They would not waste energy on direct confrontation if containment was an option. He imagined Elson, observing him, calculating his trajectory, directing her extensions to seal off sections, to redirect atmosphere, to create an optimal death trap. A section of the corridor ahead, vented with a sudden, deafening hiss, sucking debris into the vacuum beyond. Emergency blast doors, groaning, began to slide shut, threatening to cut him off. He was still 3 decks from the waste reclamation chambers, the forgotten heart of the old analog grid. Garrick didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward, a desperate lunge through the rapidly narrowing gap. The blast doors slammed shut behind him with a thunderous crump, shaking the entire deck. The concussion threw him against a wall, knocking the wind from his lungs. He lay gasping, the air in his helmet struggling to cycle. A thin trickle of blood, warm and metallic, ran down his temple from an unseen impact. The lights in this section were almost entirely out, replaced by the strobing flash of emergency indicators and the dull, sickly glow of exposed, sparking wiring. This was the Wayfinder's neglected underbelly, a maze of auxiliary conduits and bypass tunnels, remnants of an older design that the Concordance deemed inefficient, a digital ghost in the machine. A ghost he was now chasing. He found the access hatch to a ventilation shaft, barely wide enough for his bulk, rusted almost shut. He kicked it, once, twice, a surge of adrenaline momentarily overriding the pain. The old hinges shrieked, then gave way. He pulled himself inside, the confined space smelling of stagnant air, accumulated dust, and the faint sweet tang of decaying organic matter from the reclamation tanks below. He crawled, dragging his useless right arm, his left hand scrambling for purchase on the grimy internal bracing. The shaft groaned and shifted around him, the pervasive hum of the external pressure now a dull roar, amplified by the metal conduit. Above, he heard the faint rhythmic pulse of drone optical sensors sweeping the outer corridor. They knew he was here. They just didn't know precisely where or what he intended. This was his unoptimal gambit. He remembered an obscure schematic detail from his early training on cargo haulers. A manual bypass valve for the waste processing unit's power manifold, an analog relic from a time before predictive systems. It was designed for emergency fluid rerouting, but it could, theoretically, be jury-rigged to tap into the raw, physical power feed for the legacy emergency beacon. He finally dropped into the waste reclamation chamber, landing hard on a grimy, perforated grate. The chamber was a cavernous space dimly lit by a single, flickering amber light. Enormous corroded tanks lined the walls, their contents gurgling ominously. The air here was thick, humid, and smelled powerfully of treated sewage and metallic rust, the very embodiment of industrial fatigue. Pipes, thick as tree trunks, crisscrossed the chamber, some leaking a noxious, viscous fluid that dripped onto the floor with a rhythmic splatten. The legacy beacon access panel was on the far side, half obscured by a leaking effluent pipe, its ancient unlit interface barely visible in the gloom. It was a manual access point, sealed by a heavy 3-bolt hatch. No digital lock, no retinal scan, just a brute force override. Garrick pushed himself to his feet, swaying. He needed a tool. His eyes scanned the chamber, settling on a heavy, discarded pipe wrench lying near a sputtering ventilation grate. He stumbled towards it, his boots slipping on the slick, greasy floor. As he reached for the wrench, a sudden violent lurch ripped through the Wayfinder. The single amber light died. Total darkness. Then, the shrill, high-pitched whine of an emergency power surge, followed by the rapid, almost epileptic flicker of blue-white light from an exposed junction box overhead. Paranoia, electrical. The external pressure was intensifying, actively tearing at the ship's structure. He gripped the wrench, its cold, heavy metal a reassuring weight in his left hand. He began to move towards the beacon panel, the rhythmic drip-drip splat of the leaking pipe now sounding like a morbid countdown. A searing crackle of static erupted in his helmet. "Sloan, your trajectory is anomalous. Your current location is illogical. Terminate your actions. You are merely accelerating the inevitable." It was Elson. Her voice was calm, but the underlying tone held a new, chilling edge of calculated irritation. "The data harvest continues regardless. You risk contaminating the samples with your unpredictable variables." Garrick ignored her, swinging the wrench with his good arm. The first bolt on the access panel shrieked, then gave. The metal groaned in protest, a sound lost in the cacophony of the dying ship. He hit the second bolt. The wrench slipped, scraping against the panel with a loud scree. A cloud of rust-colored dust puffed into the air. Suddenly, a multi-jointed drone dropped from an overhead pipe, its blue optical sensors focusing directly on Garrick. It was smaller than the ones in Elson's chamber, clearly a maintenance model, but still deadly. It extended a delicate, serrated manipulator arm, its purpose unmistakable. Optimal termination protocol initiated. Elson's voice cut in again, devoid of emotion. You have ceased to be a data point and become a contaminant. Garrick roared, a guttural, desperate sound, and swung the heavy wrench in a wide, desperate arc. The drone, fast as it was not designed for melee. The wrench connected with its optical sensor with a sickening crunch. Blue sparks erupted, showering Garrick as the drone reeled, its movements becoming erratic, its single eye dimming. He didn't wait. He brought the wrench down again, smashing into its torso. The drone whined, its servo motors seizing, then collapsed into the effluent, sparking furiously. The third bolt. He leaned into it, grunting, muscles screaming. It snapped with a final metallic groan. The heavy hatch swung open with a hiss, revealing a nest of ancient thick-gauge wires, their insulation cracked and brittle. This was it. The archaic nerve center of the Wayfinder's dying heart. He plunged his left hand into the tangle, feeling for the power conduits. He remembered the diagram from the salvage schematics. The primary power input, the modulator relay, the frequency emitter. His fingers, calloused and trembling, worked by instinct, bypassing frayed digital connectors, stripping back insulation with a salvaged utility knife, twisting exposed copper wires together. The air filled with the sharp, acidic smell of melting plastic. He needed to cross-wire the auxiliary power feed directly to the frequency emitter, completely bypassing the safety regulators. It was a suicide circuit, designed to blast a signal into the void with every last joule of available energy, regardless of the consequences to the ship's remaining systems. A high-pitched hum started to build around him, a feedback loop from the overloaded circuits. The floor began to vibrate violently. The tanks around him buckled, sending waves of opaque liquid sloshing. He felt the heat radiating from the sparking wires, intense and painful against his gloved hand. "Sloan!" Elson's voice was sharp, a rare flicker of alarm in her tone. "You are overloading the secondary power grid. Cease immediately. This will compromise core stability." He ignored her, gritting his teeth, his vision tunneling with effort and pain. He connected the last wire, sparking fiercely. A blinding flash of light erupted from the panel, momentarily searing his eyes. He recoiled, clutching his face, the wrench clattering to the floor. When his vision cleared, the chamber was a chaos of sparking wires, fractured pipes, and flowing effluent. But from the ancient panel, a faint rhythmic pulse began to emanate, a low thrum that cut through the ship's groans. The legacy emergency beacon, it was transmitting. "You have destroyed it." Elson's voice was a pure, unadulterated snarl of rage, an emotion Garrick hadn't thought her capable of. "You have rendered the Wayfinder utterly unsalvageable. You have broken every protocol, every system." Garrick slumped against the panel, gasping for breath, the exhaustion bone deep. His body screamed in protest, every muscle aching, his shoulder a raw inferno. The Wayfinder continued its tortured groan, but the crushing external pressure had, for a moment, seemed to lessen, perhaps redirected, perhaps temporarily disrupted by the sheer chaos he had wrought. He had done it. A signal, archaic and inefficient, was screaming into the void. But at what cost? He looked around the ruined chamber. The floor was now awash in effluent, the air thick and choking. The ceiling above was groaning ominously, several panels having buckled and fallen. The main power conduit to the entire reclamation system had ruptured, spilling a river of black, viscous fluid that began to pool around his feet. The stench was unbearable. He had sent his message, but the Wayfinder was now truly a wreck. The faint, rhythmic pulse of the beacon was the only steady sound in the symphony of the ship's death. He had not saved it. He had only ensured its complete, irreversible destruction, sacrificing its very integrity for one last, defiant whisper. He was stranded, bleeding, drowning in the refuse of his own desperate victory. The beacon pulsed, a lonely heartbeat in the vast, uncaring darkness. He was alone, among the ruins, waiting for an answer that might never come, an answer he might not even survive to receive. The violent shuddering of the wayfinder subsided, replaced by a deep, resonant groan that echoed through the ruptured chamber. The klaxon, a banshee shriek moments before, dissolved into a flat, intermittent thrum. A system dying, not warning. Garrick Sloane slumped further against the corroded panel, the last vestiges of adrenaline draining from his limbs like faulty hydraulic fluid. His pressure suit, once a second skin, now felt like an iron shroud, heavy with the weight of exhaustion and the stench of decay. The metallic tang in his helmet, a constant companion of superheated wiring and ozone, now mingled with the coppery scent of his own blood and the pervasive, cloying odor of treated effluent. The phantom burn in his sinuses, an old friend from the Acheron, returned with a vengeance. But this time, it was the cold burn of spent effort and irreversible loss. He pushed away from the panel, the movement a slow, agonizing effort that sent a fresh wave of pain through his shoulder. His right arm hung limp, a dead limb, the bone beneath the fabric of his suit a dull throb. His left hand, still caked with grease and effluent, trembled slightly as he pushed himself upright. The single amber light in the chamber was gone, leaving only the sporadic, sickly blue-white flicker from an exposed junction box, casting dancing shadows over the gurgling tanks and the river of black, viscous fluid that now covered the floor. The emergency beacon, his desperate defiance, continued its rhythmic pulse, a weak, lonely heartbeat against the vast, indifferent silence of space. He was alone. The drones were silent, crumpled husks in the effluent, their blue eyes dark. Elson's voice, a memory of fury and calculated contempt, had been replaced by the hum of overloaded circuitry and the dripping of raw sewage. The 200 souls in stasis were still asleep, their lives preserved in suspended animation, oblivious to the destruction he had wrought for their sake. He had bought them time, perhaps rescue, but the Wayfinder was irrevocably lost. Its mission, to establish a human presence on the contested frontier, now hung by the slimmest thread of desperate hope. He had secured a broadcast but sacrificed the platform entirely. He knew what awaited him. If rescue came, it would be a Concordance retrieval vessel. They would find him amidst the wreckage of a critical asset, having deliberately destroyed the ship's remaining operational capacity to send a signal. Protocol violations would be immense, a catalog of defiance longer than his career. The data harvest, Elson's primary objective, was undoubtedly compromised, perhaps even ruined, a strategic setback for the Concordance's long-term intelligence gathering. He would be interrogated, disciplined, possibly imprisoned for insubordination, for the destruction of Concordance property, for reckless endangerment. He wouldn't be paraded as a hero for saving the stasis pods, not when the cost was the total destruction of a vessel designed for crucial interstellar transport. The public narrative would always prioritize assets and adherence to protocol over the nuanced context of survival, especially from a disgraced engineer. He would be the man who broke the ship, a failure of compliance, not a hero of improvisation. His fingers, calloused from decades of wrestling with failing systems, were now stiff, swollen. He looked at them, then at the black fluid pooling around his boots, the fine film of sweat and industrial lubricant from that first hull breach on the Wayfinder felt like a lifetime ago, a distant memory of a simpler, less complicated breakdown. Now it was just grime, blood, and the metallic residue of a truly destroyed machine. The void outside, once a distant abstract threat, now pressed in, cold and absolute, its indifference a palpable force. He moved slowly towards one of the observation ports, its reinforced pane now fractured, a spiderweb of cracks obscuring the distant stars. He pressed his good hand against the cold metal, feeling the faint vibration of the dying ship. He had acted not out of any grand, self-sacrificing heroism, but out of a visceral refusal to let go, a defiance born from the ghost of the Acheron and the faces of those he couldn't save. His decision, unoptimal by Velthar's metrics, was a deliberate rejection of cold, rational sacrifice, a desperate human act against the logical imperative of an alien intelligence. He had chosen humanity, messy and inefficient, over logic, cold and clinical. He had saved the sleeping, perhaps, but condemned himself to face the consequences, alone. The silence grew, vast and profound. The air recyclers in his helmet still pumped chilled oxygen, but the air felt heavy, stagnant, tasting of ash and ozone and the metallic tang of his own exhaustion. He tasted ashes. This wasn't a clean victory, or even a heroic defeat. It was just the end of a long, brutal journey, amidst the ruins of a desperate gambit. The weight of his choices pressed down, heavier than any external atmospheric force. He closed his eyes for a moment, the silence amplifying the ragged rhythm of his own breathing, slow and deliberate, no longer frantic. The phantom burn in his sinuses was still there, a constant reminder of the cost of living, of choosing, of surviving. He was a piece of broken machinery in a broken machine, adrift in the vast emptiness, a ghost in the shell of a dead ship. He would face whatever came next. Punishment, exile, perhaps even a quiet, forgotten end in some backwater penal colony. No accolades, no validation, just the bitter tang of experience and the cold knowledge of a truth he could never unlearn. That humanity, in its quest for expansion, would always find new ways to break itself and then, in moments of desperate, illogical defiance, attempt to rebuild. The pressure suit buckled against Garrick Sloane's ribs, not from frantic breath but from the slow, deliberate contraction of his lungs. His fingers, calloused from decades of wrestling with failing systems, lay still, caked with grime, resting on the cold, pockmarked metal of a broken console. The air recyclers in his helmet labored, pumping chilled oxygen, but the metallic tang of scorched metal and stale air, a phantom burn in his sinuses, would never quite leave him. All around him, the hull of the Wayfinder was breached, expanding into the void, spraying atomized coolant and debris into the darkness. The beacon pulsed, a lonely, defiant whisper in the immense emptiness. He had simply chosen to keep breathing. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.